So we continue with our series, Christ Upside Down Way, the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount was intended by Jesus to be the pathway that his followers are to follow and live out. So living God's kingdom of love here and now, that's what it's all about. So this is our fourth thing. Commitment to relationship and integrity. This is about kingdom fidelity. It's not about insurance. Fidelity means faithfulness. Faithfulness in our relationships. We're going to talk about that. Faithfulness in our promises, keeping our promises. You can't have a relationship if you don't keep your word. And so this is what we're going to talk about. Last week, we talked about murder. By way of review, this is a summary of what we talked about last week. Murder is destroying the life. Not only can destroy the life of someone made in God's image. First, in thought, through anger. Then in action, through violence, which ends in killing another human being. That's my definition of murder. So it's not just killing. It begins with anger inside us. We talk about adultery. So we know that what is important to Christ was first, murder and violence. That shouldn't be part of our life. When we follow Christ, we give up on murder, on violence, on anger as a way of relating to other humans. Because every human being is made in the image of God. And every time you strike out at a human being, you strike out at the image of God. That's how important God's image is. So adultery is perverting the nature of God. What is God's nature? Love. Adultery is a perversion of love, which he shared with humanity. First in thought through lust, then in action through illicit sexual union. So that's my short definition of adultery. We will continue today. We're going to be talking about divorce. Divorce is always not only controversial, but always painful to talk about. Because it always, brings memories. There is never a pleasant memory about divorce. When I started my practice, I handled a few divorces. That's how you make a living when you get out of law school. Divorce and bankruptcies, they go together. Divorce is breaking up the deepest interhuman relationship that God established, marriage. So we're going to talk about that today because you notice the importance of what Jesus preached at the Sermon on the Mount. First, he talked about murder, violence, anger. Then he talked about adultery. Now he's talking about divorce. This is all related to relationships. And along with divorce, we're going to be talking about integrity. Integrity is the cornerstone of all relationships. You cannot have a successful relationship without integrity. What does integrity mean? It can mean in many ways, but basically, you're honest, you keep your promises. That's basic. To any relationship. If you start lying, if you start breaking your promises, you have no hope of ever having a good relationship. So integrity goes to the heart of any relationship. So we're going to be talking about that. So Jesus talked about these topics in the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to talk about marriage. God established marriage as the deepest relationship for loving, growing, and protecting the human family. I want you to understand, when God established marriage in the Garden of Eden between the first two human beings, Adam and Eve, He established the deepest relationship for loving, growing, and protecting the human family. That's the purpose of marriage. Anytime that purpose is not being met, the marriage essentially has broken down. And that's why there is divorce. When it's no longer possible for two people who began this deepest relationship that God intended to love, for growing and loving and protecting the human. Well, that's no longer possible. That's when divorce comes in. So we're going to be talking about that. So before we go to the Sermon on the Mount, as a background, we'll go to an incident where Jesus was asked by some Pharisees a legal question. They're hoping to trick him. In Matthew 19, 3-6, some Pharisees came to him to test him. Remember, they're not really serious about their question. They just want to test Jesus. But Jesus doesn't mind, because he wants to teach them and correct their wrong understanding of Moses' law. Okay? They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? That was the question. During the time of Jesus and in the Old Testament, divorce was not obtained through any court or legal process. Who had the power to divorce? The husband. The husband had the sole power to divorce his wife, as long as he complies with the Jewish religious rules. And that's where the trick is, to how to interpret the Jewish rules. As a result, the divorce rules were widely abused by the male Jews, because the wife cannot divorce the husband. In the Old Testament, the cause for adultery cannot be the cause for divorce, because if you're caught in adultery, you are killed. So that's your divorce Italian style. You're divorced by death. So the divorce rules were used and abused by the Jewish males. So Jesus answered. He answered, have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. I used to ask in weddings when I perform, which one? They're one, the two has become one, but which one? For the Jews in the Old Testament, it's the husband. The wife had no rights. The wife was considered as chattel or personal property. See, Jesus doesn't answer the question directly. Okay? He answers it by establishing the principle, the main principle and reason for marriage. If you start there, then you'll be focused on preserving this wonderful and greatest and deepest relationship that God established for humanity, instead of looking for excuse to get out of marriage. See, the Jews practiced polygamy. Every patriarch had more than one wife. Even old Abraham had more than one wife. I think Isaac was the only monogamist. Jacob had what, 4 wives?
Yeah, but he was tricked.
Yeah, but women always try to trick you.
That was the woman.
It was the father-in-law who tricked him.
Yes.
Anyway, he doesn't answer, is it lawful to divorce a woman for any cause? See, there's the catch, any cause. All right? So he answers by defining marriage. I always want to make sure when a client comes to me for divorce, I want to make sure that that person understands what marriage is all about. So I don't just file. He goes through counseling, shares my concept of marriage from the Bible, what Jesus taught. So they understand what they're breaking up. Okay? I'm not against divorce. I'll tell you later how we should deal with divorce. So let's look at how Jesus defined marriage. First, no longer two, but one flesh. Okay. So when you get a divorce, you're tearing apart one flesh. That's why it's painful. Divorce, no matter how mad you are at the other spouse, it's always painful. From the very beginning of humankind's existence, God made marriage not about two separate persons, protecting their rights, making sure they have rights in the marriage. It was always about one flesh. Two had become one. That was how God designed it. And if you try to stay married as two individual persons, you're not fulfilling God's design. God's design is two is now one. So that's the first point of Jesus. Quoting from Genesis chapter 2. Okay, he quotes. Later on, Paul in Ephesians would also quote, teaching Jesus about this. And the second point that Jesus makes about marriage is what God had joined together. Jesus teaches in a logical way. He doesn't just answer, about divorce, this. No, he starts with, you're breaking up a marriage. What is marriage? So he defines it. Two, no longer two, but one flesh. That's what you're breaking up. Understand that first, before I tell you what I believe about divorce. Okay? And who put you together? God. Well, you say, a judge married me, not a minister. Civil union. If you are married, you are following God's idea, what He established at the beginning of humankind's existence. So Jesus follows this logic from the Genesis account of marriage by stating clearly that it was God who established the institution of marriage of two people who are no longer two. The moment they become married, they become one flesh. And now he goes to the question, how could you now separate two that had become one? They didn't just become one by themselves. It was God who joined them together. That's the Jesus teaching. So let's summarize what Jesus defined marriage. Marriage is both exclusive. Notice, a man shall leave his father and mother and be with his wife. Exclusive. It doesn't include the parents. If you are parents, you're not included when your children get married. Stay out. It's exclusive to the two who have become one. The father and mother have to be left out. Okay? And it's permanent. Okay? Permanent. As far as God is concerned, there's no change in His plan. It's permanent. There might be some adjustments due to God's mercy, but the marriage, as far as God is concerned, is permanent. Okay? Because they're joined together. The man is joined to his wife. Thus, marriage, according to our Lord's exposition of its origins, is a divine institution by which God makes permanently one two people who decisively and publicly leave their parents in order to form a new unit of society and then become one flesh. So Jesus first establishes what marriage is. He defines it. And then we have this statement from the Old Testament. God hates divorce. Why? Because it destroys what He designed to be the primary institution for loving, nurturing, and developing humanity. There is no other institution for that purpose. Humanity, created in God's image, each person is to develop into the image of God, which is love. And the family was designed to do that. The loving, the nurturing, and developing each child in the family into the image of God. It takes place in the family primarily. The church helps, but you only go to church 2 hours a week. And you're not together. There's a children's division, there's adult division, there's a youth division. So, Malachi, you go to the prophet Malachi. You remember Malachi? He's the prophet who called you a robber if you don't tithe. This is what he said. Didn't the Lord make you one with your wife? He's talking to Jewish husbands. In body and spirit, you are His. Okay? It means you belong to the Lord. As a married person, the Lord made you into one flesh. But not only that, He didn't make you to be independent of Him. So marriage is not independent of God. The God who made you into one flesh, you belong to Him. So when you break up that marriage, you're trying to break free from the God who made you into one flesh. That's why God hates divorce. And what does He want? Godly children from your union. See? Your union, the purpose is you develop children who look like God. God created you in His image. And it's the family, the husband and wife, one flesh, made by God, to be attached to God. And they together produce children and develop them into godly children. So He's talking to the husbands. So guard your heart. Remain loyal to the wife of your youth. Why does He say that? Because as the couple gets older, it was practiced among the Jews to marry another younger person. younger wife, because they're polygamists. Okay? But sometimes, see there, without divorce, you just keep adding. You don't dispose. What happens is the poor wife, who's now old and wrinkled, can't remarry. He is now treated as a maid. And every time the husband gets mad, he beats up the wife. So this is the condition when God allowed divorce. Okay? But he hates it. This came from Malachi. 5 centuries before, 500, more than 500 years before Jesus came, the last prophet of the Old Covenant, Malachi, called out the Jews for their continued disregard of the oneness of the husband and the wife. We know Malachi for Malachi 3, calling us robbers if we don't give tithe. But he was also sent by God, the last prophet of the Old Covenant, to tell husbands how God felt about their cruel treatment of their wives. He says, "For I hate divorce." Hate. Says the Lord, the God of Israel. Okay? And he continues, "To divorce your wife is to overwhelm her with cruelty, says the Lord of heaven's armies. So guard your heart. Do not be unfaithful to your wife." It's prophet words. Why does God hate divorce? Because divorce does not only hurt the wife, it hurts the entire human family. Every time there's a breakup of marriage, the children of that marriage will no longer have the original design of the deepest relationship for the nurture, for the loving and development of the children into godly persons. They are to train. Husband and wife are to serve, minister to each other. And so as the children see their example of others-centered and self-giving love, they develop also into children who will be unselfish and minister to others. If you divorce, you lose this. That's why it's so hard after a divorce. And then you fight over who's going to take care of the children. Okay? In the days of the Jews, only the husband can divorce. So divorce was a selfish act of the husband. He's actually breaking his promise to love and cherish, a promise he made in the presence of God. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus clearly states the right cause for a divinely sanctioned divorce. There is divorce, but here Jesus makes a statement based on Old Testament rules. Okay? So in Matthew 5, 30 to 31, this is the part of the Sermon on the Mount after Jesus talked about murder and adultery. He said, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." That's in the Old Testament. It looks like the only requirement that the Pharisees honored is give a certificate of divorce. What's the reason for that? So the wife can remarry. It frees the wife to remarry. Without a certificate of divorce, the wife has no rights. Can't remarry. If she remarries, she would be in an adulterous state. She needs a certificate of divorce. The certificate of divorce protected the wife from abuse by cruel husbands who didn't want to support their wife. Without divorce, if you're old, your family won't take you back anymore. Without a divorce certificate, you can't remarry. Okay? So, that's what it says in the Old Testament. But now Jesus says, here is what I say. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity. Remember, it's not adultery, it's unchastity. We just assume it's adultery. Adultery is part of it, but in the Old Testament it wasn't adultery because they killed you for adultery. That's not a cause for divorce. That's a cause for the death penalty. So unchastity causes her to commit adultery. See, if you divorce, because they have the right to divorce, hand the certificate. But if it's not unchastity, the husband is now guilty of causing her, if she remarries, of committing adultery. Okay? And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Don't take that out of context. This is the rules in the Old Covenant. Because the rules said that you can't marry a woman unless there's a certificate of divorce. Well, what would be the cause, the good cause? Jesus says it's unchastity, not just any cause. But the Jews were not living by those rules. If he didn't like how the rice was cooked, certificate of divorce. Anything. In fact, we'll go to Deuteronomy and look at it, and it looks like it's giving carte blanche to husbands who are abusive. So, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had just spoken about adultery in the heart. Okay? When a person lusts after another, you have adultery of that. Now he breaks new ground. He goes into something, adultery as a state in an illicit relationship. So it's no longer lust, but you go into a relationship and you enter a state of what Jesus calls adultery. If the divorce is not based on what Jesus said is unchastity. Okay? Why did God allow divorce? God allowed divorce as a merciful accommodation to men's hard-heartedness and to protect wives from the husband's exploitation and abuse. Women didn't have any rights. Look at Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, where the divorce provision is from the Mosaic law. Let's read it. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, okay, he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house. Okay? So, the Jews, we're talking about male Jews because they're the only ones who can do this, understood this to be a command. So they think that's the rule. If you're not happy with your wife, you're commanded to give a certificate of divorce. And Jesus said it's not a command. It's a protection for the wife because of your cruelty and hard-heartedness. Okay? Okay. He writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, sends her out, and goes and becomes another man's wife. Now she can remarry. Okay? That gave her the right to remarry. Without the divorce certificate, she would be in adultery if she went with another person. So divorce mainly was given as a protection for women. The guys don't need any protection because they can just add another wife. They're polygamists. Okay? And if the latter husband finds that something wrong with her, damaged goods, turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce. Now she's got 2 certificates. And puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. That's the process. Here in your hand. Goodbye. There's the door.
Absurd.
It was easy for the husband. Now you have to go to court, pay a divorce lawyer. It's so hard. But it was, when it's easy, it's abuse. Or, or if she gets divorced, or if the husband dies, the second husband dies, she cannot go back to the first husband. That's the rule. It prevents the husband from toying with the women that I can send, get rid of you anytime and take you back if I want to. No, you can't. For that husband, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. Okay? For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. So let's look at the summary of the Mosaic law divorce rules, which the people during Jesus' times were trying to interpret liberally as much as possible. Okay? First, the husband finds some indecency. We don't know what that means. It can mean anything. I don't like your hairdo. I don't like your smell. That could be, because indecency is not about adultery or cheating, because the punishment is death, not divorce. So this is besides that. Okay?
So does the husband have to specify the indecency?
No.
Just says, no, she's indecent, I have
Yeah.
to divorce her.
There's a certificate. So before you marry, women make sure they don't have any certificates ready. Then husband must write a certificate of divorce.
If he's illiterate.
Husband gives his wife the certificate and sends her away. They can't live together after their divorce. Why? Because it allows the woman to be married again. Because if no one marries her, she's out on the street. She becomes a prostitute. That's what happens most of the time. Okay? So the wife, when she gets a certificate, it's like graduation, may remarry another man. Okay? And then the rule is the first husband may not remarry the wife if she gets divorced or widowed later, because she is considered defiled. So the basis of the Old Testament divorce is solely the husband find some indecency in the wife. And the Jews had 2 camps, two groups of Pharisees. One is very strict, another is very liberal about divorce rules. So now Jesus comes along, and he's going to settle the question of what divorce is acceptable to God. Because it's God who allowed them to divorce. Originally, he didn't plan for divorce. This was an act of mercy for the women who were being oppressed and treated cruelly by the husband. New Testament grounds for divorce. First, unchastity. Matthew 19:7-9. Jesus answered. They said to him, "Why did then Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" Okay. After Jesus said that the two have become one flesh, what God had joined together, let no man separate. The Jews countered, "Why did Moses command us to give her a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" They considered that as a command. It was an option only, not a command. So he said to them, it was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. Okay? So it was not the original plan for humans to break up their marriage relationships. But because the husbands were cruel, hard-hearted, and abusive towards their wives, especially after they got tired of them or found something wrong with them. I didn't know you couldn't cook spaghetti. To protect the wives who were being abused by their unhappy husbands, divorce was allowed. But now he says, this is how you divorce. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity, see, that's the word, and marries another, commits adultery. Okay? If you divorce your wife, if there's no unchastity, you or your wife cannot remarry. If you remarry, the one who's divorcing, and the wife remarries, both of them will be in adultery, including their new spouses. That's what. So what is unchastity? All right. It's not just any cause like the Pharisees have come to know during Jesus' time. The Greek word here is porneia,
Pornography.
from which we derive the English word pornography. The Greek dictionaries tell us that porneia means unchastity, fornication. You know what fornication is?
Yes.
Bernard, what's your definition of fornication?
Illicit sex, I don't know, with somebody that's not married to you. I don't
Yeah. Illicit sex with unmarried persons. If one party is unmarried, that's fornication. If both parties are married, that's adultery. So that's the difference. You know. Prostitution. Okay. If your wife has a nighttime job as a sideline, as a prostitute, that would be unchastity. Okay. Unlawful intercourse. What's unlawful intercourse? When porneia is applied to married persons, it means marital unfaithfulness. That could cover a lot. It doesn't have to be physical. Unfaithfulness. Okay? Maintaining intimate relationship with another person. Illicit intercourse involves homosexuality, bestiality, and the like. You know what I mean? You have sex with animals. That's an issue when they were all farmers. They get lonely. And the sheep looks good. That's why there's a prohibition in the Old Testament against that. Because they were doing it. So if you committed that during the Old Testament, you were executed because there's a death penalty. But once the Jews didn't have their own government, they were not allowed to impose the death penalty. So all these things that were reason for executing you as a spouse for committing this thing is now in the New Testament or during the time of the Romans called unchastity. Okay? Originally published under Mosaic law. This since terminated marriage not by divorce but by death. So that's the first one, unchastity. So we'll talk later about modern times, but these were the times of Jesus. It's limited to what were penalized by death when they had their own government. Okay? That's according to Jesus. Now, understand that if you know the purpose of marriage, you cannot twist your understanding of divorce and defeat the purpose of marriage. Okay? So in the New Testament, Paul added another cause. Okay? Not just unchastity. Okay? And it's desertion. 1 Corinthians 7:12-16. For all the others I say this, I am saying this, not the Lord. Okay. Paul is clear that this is not the teaching of Jesus. But as an apostle, he's making an adjustment according to their circumstances now. When Jesus spoke, he was speaking to all Jews. So Jewish customs and society was the norm and the background for the teachings of Jesus. But now that you have majority Gentiles, you have a different situation. So there's now an adjustment for divorce rules. So this is what he's saying. It's not from the Lord. I'm saying this. If a Christian man has a wife who is not a believer and she is happy to live with him, he must not divorce her. Okay? And if a Christian woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is happy to live with her, she must not divorce him. The husband who is not a believer is made holy through his believing wife. What does that mean? There's a chance that the unbeliever, by the example and witness of the believing spouse, might change. So don't devalue that. And the wife who is not a believer is made holy to her believing husband. If this were not true, your children would not be clean. But now your children are holy. But if those who are not believers decide to leave, they don't want to be married to a Christian, let them leave. Okay. When this happens, the Christian man or woman is free. That means they can remarry. If you don't have an unbelief. So in Paul's time, they made this adjustment. They have to leave. You don't leave. Okay? So don't cook good food, so they leave. Set them up. See, when you're technical, you always set each other up. It's not about rules. God had called us to live in peace. Wife, you don't know, maybe you will save your husband. And husband, you don't know, maybe you will save your wife. So there is what I call apostolic cultural adjustment to some of these principles that were declared by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in the context of a Jewish society. Okay? So during Jesus' time, the Jews did not marry non-Jews. So this was not an issue. Okay? In the early church, many new converts were wives or husbands of non-believers. So an adjustment to the rules had to be made for this situation. So this is what we must remember when we're talking about how to treat people who have divorced when they come into the church. Okay? Divorce is not a command, but God's merciful accommodation due to the hardness of the human heart and for the protection of the less privileged spouse. So it doesn't have to be always the woman or the wife. Maybe the husband is the one that's being beaten up every day. So and Bernard is nodding his head. Less privileged spouse. Divorce is really a public acknowledgement that the marriage is already broken. That the goal of marriage, loving, nurturing, and developing the family, is irretrievably beyond reach by the parties involved. Okay? That means you're giving up. And God is merciful. He's not a legalist. And the church shouldn't be. Okay? This is a principle So what adjustments can the church make in the 21st century? What other causes would be acceptable, so to speak, in the modern times that is not classified as unchastity? Well, how about continuous physical cruelty or emotional abuse? Violence is worse than adultery because it was first in the Sermon on the Mount. So don't wait for an adulterous situation for allowing a divorce. If the wife or the husband is getting beaten up emotionally and physically, and the children is watching this, then there should be a merciful end to this marriage. Okay. How about continuous abuse of the children, not just the spouse? The purpose of marriage is to nurture and develop the children. Then you're not going to accomplish this if they're being abused by one of the spouses. How about long-term imprisonment? Incarceration for a felony or something, long-term. Is the wife to wait to be released? It's 30 years, 20 years, whatever. I don't think we should be hard and fast, understanding the purpose of marriage. How about serious addiction? Where, because of addiction, one spouse can't work anymore, can't contribute, steals money all the time, borrows money from other people, doesn't take care of the kids. I think these are some reasons. How about, I understand that for any difficulty and you can't take it anymore, you can get a divorce anywhere, but should the church accept that? I think they should. It's the remarriage that's the issue. If the cause isn't acceptable, the cause of the divorce. Okay? For example, that's an issue in countries where there's no divorce. Philippines is one of 2 countries in the whole world that does not have a divorce. The only Catholic country that does not have a divorce law. So now, they have the lowest rate of divorce. Even the divorce in the United States is going down because people don't get married anymore. They say marriage is the number 1 cause of divorce. We met some parents in the Philippines who advised their children not to marry right away. Live in, try each other. Because if that person is not right for you, you can't get a divorce, you're stuck. So we meet people who have been abandoned by their spouses because they can't get a divorce. They just leave, shack up with another person, now have a family, and now they also, seeking support from other people, get paired with that, but they can't get married because there's no divorce. And they come into the church. What do you do? Sometimes ministers won't baptize them because they're not married. Especially if they have children already, you're not going to separate them. How are they going to survive? They barely survive staying together. It's hard. We've met a lot of people, There was a couple in Romblon one time who wanted to get baptized, but they couldn't get married. They had children already, many, but they couldn't get married because their spouse, they can't get a divorce. Their spouse already is another family. So it's hard with countries with no divorce law. Now, if we're going to, it used to be the church said, unless it's for adultery, you cannot remarry. Well, you don't investigate every divorce now. Plus, if they don't want to make it public what their problem is. And most states don't have that anymore. It used to be the cause for divorce is just adultery and incurable insanity. They question your sanity. Why did you get married to this guy? He must be insane. So they have private detectives taking pictures, so they're caught in the act. This is proof. Okay. But many states, California was one of the first to have no-fault divorce. I understand what that means. It means that the children don't have to blame any parent. The purpose of marriage is to nurture the children. Now when you divide, there's one guilty party that's ostracized, and they don't have that parent-children relationship. So California came up with a no-fault divorce. You don't have to, it's just irreconcilable differences. What was that all about? Well, I wanted over easy and she wanted scrambled. That's irreconcilable.
That's the easy one to work out.
And churches, what do you do with the guilty spouses? If you find someone guilty. I remember when we were in an old denomination, one of our friends got separated from his wife. And there's no way for them to get together again. It's just, they're not going to reconcile. So he started courting another woman. Okay. And in fact, divorced his first wife and then married this woman. What did we do? We disfellowship him. Because that's, unless you can say that your divorce from your first wife is adultery, any remarriage is adultery, according to how we understand what Jesus said. So it turned out, but we worked with that person who still said, we love you, this is just the rules. Later on, he got rebaptized with a new wife. But it's hard. And we can't play judge and jury in terms of accepting people when they're divorced. We don't know their stories. And unless they're willing to tell you, you don't know what they went through. Every time there's a divorce, people get hurt a lot because divorce is painful. Try ripping your hangnail out. That's painful, isn't it? That's just a little part of your body. When two people become one flesh, if you separate them, it's going to be very, very painful. Not only to those husband and wife, but to the children and their friends and their family. Sometimes friends have to choose sides. And that's painful too. So what do we do? I don't want us to specialize on divorce rules so we can condemn or not condemn people. Here's what Christ wants. Christ wants his followers to trust God's plan and to focus on growing and enriching marriage. Okay? So, Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5 have this counsel. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. And Paul was very specific. Love your own wife, not someone else's wife. You have your own wife. Okay. As their own bodies. Why? Because you're one flesh. He who loves his wife loves himself. There's no difference between loving yourself and loving your wife if you believe that you're one flesh. Okay? For no one ever hated his own flesh unless you're having a bad hair day. You hate your hair. But nourishes and cherishes it, or just as the Lord does the church. So marriage is compared to the relationship between Christ and his church. That's the deepest relationship that you could have, because it's compared to the relationship of Christ and his church. Okay. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Quote again from Genesis 2. This is a great mystery, okay? Two becoming one flesh. Paul did not even attempt to explain it. It's a great mystery. Jesus said it. God said it in Genesis 2. Trust God. That's what Paul is saying. Trust God's logic, not ours. But I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself. And let the wife see that she respects her husband. So that's the counsel. Focus on enriching your marriage. Don't try to figure out a valid reason for getting out of the marriage. Otherwise, you'll be setting it up for failure. Don't look for unchastity, whatever that is. Colossians 3, 14 and 15. Above all, clothe yourselves with love. This is an all relationship, but especially in marriage, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Clothe ourselves with love. In other words, move and see each other and talk to each other in love. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body. And be thankful. Be thankful. Ephesians 3, 18 and 19. May you experience the love of Christ. Though it's so great you will never fully understand it, then you will be filled with the fullness of life and power that comes from God. You need the love, the life, and power of God to stay married. Why? Because marriage was designed for two persons to become one flesh, attached to God, the one who made you one. If you're not attached to God, you're on your own, it's going to be difficult to act and live as one flesh. It's God's idea. It's his power that keeps you together. Jesus also talks about integrity. Why? Why does he talk about it after talking about divorce? Promises and truth are important to God. And he wants us to be persons of integrity who are deserving of others people's trust. Unless you can be trusted by your spouse, you don't have a chance of having a successful marriage. Okay? So in Matthew 5, 32 to 37, this is on the Sermon on the Mount. The next, after we talk about divorce, it says, again, you have heard that it was said to our ancestors, you must not break your oath. Okay? But you must keep your oaths to the Lord. So in the Old Testament, they always make oaths in the name of the Lord. But I tell you, so now this is the new teaching from Jesus, don't take an oath at all. Either by heaven, if you say, I swear to the heavens, on my mother's grave, your mother is still alive. Why do people say that? So you'll believe them. But if you know that person to be honest and trustworthy, who keeps his promises, he doesn't have to swear by anything. This is what Jesus is trying to teach. Be consistent. Don't go with people. Don't follow people who are not trustworthy, who don't keep their promises, who lie all the time. If you do, you're going to be suspect too, by association. So it says here, I tell you, don't take an oath either by heaven, because it is God's throne. So you're disrespecting God's throne if you don't use God in any way to prove that you are trustworthy. Your trustworthiness should be seen from your consistent living and treatment of other people. Because it is God. Or by the earth, because it is footstool. Or by Jerusalem, because it is the city of the great king. Neither should you swear by your head. I swear on my head, because you cannot make a single hair white or black. But let your word, yes, be yes. If you say yes, it means yes. No qualification. And your no be no. Anything more than this is from the evil one. You know these people who give, if someone is selling you something, and you're having a hard time believing, and he comes with all kinds of affidavits, the more you should be careful. Because the only safe way is to deal with persons whom you know to be trustworthy. Okay? You're taking a chance, especially these days. Because the Jews followed the tradition of swearing by many items. Okay? They want to sell you their new flock that they got from another area. And you haven't seen it, so they'll swear. I swear they're all good looking. They're all healthy. On my father's beard, or whatever they swear. On the high priest's robe or something. They use all kinds of stuff. This was a practice. And Christ taught that we don't swear by anything in order to make other people believe our statements. If we are consistent in telling the truth and keeping our promises, we will be known as people with integrity and to be trustworthy people. In the Old Testament, Numbers 30, verse 2, a man who makes a vow to the Lord or makes a pledge under oath must never break it. He must do exactly what he said he would do. This is not just about business transactions. It's also about marriage. No one gets married without making a vow. I don't know. Every person who got married made a vow of some sort. No one takes up a position in government without taking an oath to defend the Constitution and to fulfill the duties that he's taking on. They take an oath. So one time, there were Christians who would not take an oath. When they're witnessing, they would not put their hand on the Bible, because that would be sacrilege. The Bible says, don't swear. And now you're using the Bible. So now you're not required to put your hand on the Bible. You will just say that what you're saying is the truth. You want to say, so help me God. But if you're an atheist, you don't have to say, so help me God.
And if you did, it wouldn't be believable.
Yeah, because... But in the New Testament, we have counsel from one of the apostles, James 5:12. Most of all, my brothers and sisters, never take an oath. So, I think some conservative Christian groups from Europe took this literally. By heaven or earth or anything else. That's what it means. On anything. Just say a simple yes or no, so that you will not sin and be condemned. Wow. Okay. Why does Christ want his followers to have integrity? Here's the reason why. The foundation of all relationship is God's integrity, his faithfulness in keeping all his promises. We cannot have a relationship with other people without a relationship with God. But we cannot have a relationship with God if we don't believe he is faithful in keeping all his promises. It flows from the integrity of our God. Our integrity flows from the integrity of our God. Look at this, Psalm 33:4. This is what the psalmist believed. For the word of the Lord is upright, and all his work is done in faithfulness. So you have to have that relationship of trust in our Creator, in our Heavenly Father, so you can have a relationship with other people. All relationships are based on God's integrity. Okay? Psalm 145:13, the Lord will keep all his promises. He is loyal to all he has made. So, God is not only selective of people who believe in him. Everything he made, he's faithful and loyal to them. 146, Psalm 146, 6. He made heaven and earth, the sea, and everything in them. He keeps every promise forever. That's how faithful our God is. And if we're made in the image of God, His Son who came to save us wants us to be people of integrity. Because integrity will keep our marriages together. Every broken marriage resulted from broken promises. Questionable integrity. So how do we become people of integrity? Trusting God's promises is the key to becoming a person of integrity. 2 Peter 1:4, it says, and because of His glory and excellence, He has given us great and precious promises. These are the promises that enable you to share His divine nature and escape the world's corruption caused by human desires. So what Peter is saying is God has promised to share His divine nature with us. And part of His divine nature is His faithfulness and integrity. And when we share, when we actually believe that He shares His divine nature, we escape the world's corruption, where you can't trust people's words, where promises are broken. Hebrews 10:23. But it says, let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep His promise. If we trust God to keep all His promises, He will enable us to become people of integrity. We will keep our promises. We will keep our word. 1 Thessalonians 5:24, the Apostle Paul says, God will make this happen, for He calls you. He who calls you is faithful. We become faithful if we have a relationship to the one who is always faithful. Our faithfulness, our integrity comes from the one who created us and calls us to be people of integrity. So where do we get faithfulness? We don't manufacture it. When you are tempted to be unfaithful in your relationship, in marriage, in friendship, in any other relationship that requires faithfulness, this is what the Apostle Paul tells us, where we get our faithfulness. Galatians 5:22, but the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, what? Faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Faithfulness is the fruit of the Holy Spirit. Without the Holy Spirit inside us, producing this fruit of love and faithfulness, we can never be people of integrity. We can never be faithful in our marriage, faithful in our associations, faithful in our friendships. So Jesus calls us not to devise ways and means to cause people to believe our word. Just develop a relationship with a God who is faithful. Just rely on the Spirit of God who now indwells us to produce His fruit of love and faithfulness. There will be moments when you will be tempted to break your integrity so you can avoid loss or so you can gain something. But it's not worth it. The God who created us is faithful, and He called us to be faithful, not only in our marriage, but in everything that we do, in all our relationships, in all our transactions. We should be the people with the most integrity that people can trust. When we say we'll do it, we will do it. When we say yes, it means yes. When we say no, it means no. That's what Jesus calls us to do. And He is faithful. So we can be faithful.